Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The walk back from Murren's post took 4 hours and 40 minutes, and Eli Voss spent approximately 4 hours and 39 of them composing, in his head, a strongly worded letter to the Colonial Frontier Office regarding their position on skimmer parts. The letter was detailed. It was specific. It named the clerk. It would never be sent because the CFO controlled his operating license, and Eli had not survived 11 years on Cathara 7 by making administrative enemies, but the composition of it passed the kilometers in a way that almost made up for the walking. Almost. Cathara 7 had the quality of a place that wanted to be appreciated on its own terms or not at all. The tree analogues along the northern trail grew in that particular bruised violet that had no satisfying name in any human language. He'd heard people try cerise, mauve, something between wine and dusk, and they shed a fine phosphorescent pollen at this hour that caught the last of the light and made the path ahead look like something from a fever dream, if the fever was extremely beautiful and occasionally tried to eat you. The atmosphere after the afternoon rains tasted faintly of copper. The wildlife was, as always, present in the sounds it chose not to make. He had been out 8 hours. Resupply, position, report, the argument about the water filtration unit, lunch at the single establishment in Murren's post that qualified as a restaurant if you were generous with definitions, and then the walk. His pack weighed exactly what it had weighed before the argument about the water filtration unit, because he had lost the argument, and the weight of losing it was distributed evenly across both shoulders. The base camp came into view through the last stand of violet trees, just as the copper smell sharpened into something almost metallic. The pressure shift that preceded Cathara 7 evening cycle, the planet's way of suggesting that things with shelter should use it. Eli noted the perimeter sensors at their intervals, the sealed equipment containers, the habitat tent with its rated walls and its modest insistence on remaining structurally sound. Everything as left, everything correct. He went inside to drop his pack. He reorganized 2 items that had shifted in transit. He drank half a liter of water. He checked the internal temperature reading out of habit, noted it was fine, and was back outside in 4 minutes. The woman was sitting beside his fire. She was warming her hands over it with the concentrated, serious attention of someone who had made warming her hands the entire project of the current moment, and was not available for other inquiries. She did not startle when he came out. She did not apologize. She turned her head toward him with the unhurried patience of someone checking the weather, and her eyes, when they met his, were fractionally too large for a human face, amber mostly, but threaded through with filaments of bioluminescence that pulsed once, very faintly, when she registered him. Her skin carried a depth that light treated differently than physics usually required. Her clothing was torn at the shoulder, and along one thigh, muddy in the specific way of someone who had made close acquaintance with Cathara 7 Northern Creek beds, and she held her left arm at an angle that a physiotherapist would have found instructive. She was, Eli noted, approximately as exhausted as a person could be and still be technically a person. "Your fire," she said, in accented but fluent colonial standard, "was the first warm thing I'd found in 3 days." A pause. "I can leave if you'd prefer." She did not move. Eli stood at the entrance of his tent, on a frontier world, 50 kilometers from the nearest other human, and looked at the stranger who had settled into his camp with the serene confidence of someone who had decided that surviving took clear precedence over etiquette, and he experienced, in fairly rapid order, surprise, professional assessment, the specific exhaustion of a long walk made longer by an unexpected variable, and the faintly embarrassing awareness that whatever he had planned for this evening, ration heating, sensor log review, the continued internal drafting of a letter to the CFO, was no longer remotely the point. The fire crackled between them. "You've been here long enough to dry your clothes," he said finally. It was not a question. It was the sentence of a man buying himself time to catch up with the situation. A little while, she said, which was not an answer, and she delivered it with an expression that seemed aware of this and entirely at peace with it. Eli set his pack down by the tent entrance. He looked at the fire, at her, at the fire again. Then he pulled the second camp stool from beside the equipment container. He owned two, because optimism was its own kind of survival strategy, unfolded it, and sat down on his side of the flames. "I'm Eli," he said. "Sail," she said. The fire crackled again. Above them, Cathara 7 first moon was making its appearance in the violet dark sky, and somewhere in the middle distance something in the undergrowth decided against whatever it had been considering and went quietly back to reconsidering. The camp was still his. It was also, very clearly, something else now. He heated the rations because it was the only reasonable thing to do, and because doing something with his hands gave him somewhere to put the part of his attention that kept wanting to ask questions he hadn't yet decided were his to ask. The rations were a brand called Nutra-Pak Standard, which advertised itself on the packaging with the phrase "engineered for the frontier human" in a font that suggested optimism, and which tasted, as Eli had once described to the CFO radio operator best during a slow-weather week, like something a machine had produced after being given a written description of food by another machine that had never eaten anything either. He handed Sail the second portion without ceremony. She took it with both hands and ate with the systematic, almost mechanical focus of someone who had reclassified food as fuel and was simply completing a transfer. He let her finish before he said anything. That, too, was a field decision. "Your arm," he said, when she set the empty container down. She looked at it. Then she looked at him with the expression of someone who has been caught being injured and finds the experience mildly inconvenient. "It's functional," she said. "That's a low bar. It's a sufficient bar." He got the medical scanner from the kit without asking again, because asking a second time would have started a negotiation he didn't have the evening for. She watched him produce it with the specific expression of someone encountering a piece of technology they have decided, on principle, not to trust yet. He turned it on. It emitted a sound like a polite disagreement and began its sweep. "What is that rated for?" she said. "Multi-species use. Colonial Frontier Standard issue." "Which species specifically?" He read off the list. It was not a short list. It was also, they both became aware as he reached the end of it, a list that did not include Velosians. "It will probably be fine," he said. She looked at him with the amber eyes and the bioluminescent threads and the expression of a person who has done the mental calculation very quickly. "Probably fine," she said, is a phrase that has preceded a statistically significant percentage of history's worst outcomes. "That's true," he said. "But most of those outcomes didn't involve a bruised arm on a frontier world with no alternatives within 50 kilometers. She considered this with apparent sincerity, and then, because the argument was structurally sound, she extended her arm. The scanner managed. It reported the left arm as bruised, not broken, which he had suspected, and flagged the lacerations along her collarbone as superficial but worth cleaning, which he had also suspected, and then produced a readout of her general condition in a series of numbers that the manual would have helped him interpret and which he no longer owned the manual for. What he could tell without the manual was that she was exhausted in a way that had moved past the temporary and into the physiological, the kind of tired that meant the body had been keeping promises the circumstances hadn't earned yet. He cleaned the lacerations. She permitted this with the air of someone making a significant concession and tracking it carefully in an internal ledger. Her skin, where it was undamaged, had that quality he'd noticed by the fire, not a shimmer, exactly, more a depth, as though light were doing something considered and deliberate against her rather than simply bouncing off. Where the injury had settled in, it had deepened to a burnished blue-green, which was biologically interesting and also, he noted privately and did not remark upon, somewhat arresting in the firelight. He was a professional. The temperature dropped with the second moon's rise, the way it always did on Cathara 7, efficiently and without consultation, and he fed the fire and did not remark on the arrangement of the evening. She watched the flames with a quality of attention that suggested she was not, in fact, simply watching flames. Some part of her was elsewhere, sorting, cataloging, deciding. "You were traveling with someone," he said. Not a question this time either, just a direction, a pause that had weight in it. "A research expedition," she said. "We were operating under a surveying license. Northern Ridge System." Another pause. "The expedition is no longer intact." He didn't push. He had a frontier man's relationship with information. He'd learned to let it arrive on its own schedule rather than attempting to accelerate it, because acceleration usually just produced the parts people were comfortable inventing rather than the parts they actually knew. What she offered instead, before the fire dropped to the level where the question of sleeping arrangements could no longer be deferred, was quieter and more considered. She told him that he was not what she had expected a human wilderness guide to be. He asked what she had expected. She thought about it with what appeared to be genuine effort. "Louder," she said. Eli looked at her. She met the look with the calm of someone who had said the accurate thing and was content to let it stand. He decided, on reflection, that it was probably a compliment. He was not entirely sure. He set up the emergency thermal blanket for her by the fire, went inside his tent, and lay down in the dark listening to Cathara 7 doing what Cathara 7 always did at night, which was make sounds in the middle distance that suggested it was keeping its options open. He fell asleep faster than he expected to, which he attributed to the walking, and not to anything else. The sensor alert came at the precise moment Eli raised his first cup of reconstituted coffee to his mouth, which he noted with the grim recognition of a man who has lived long enough in the field to understand that the universe has a sense of timing, and it is not benevolent. He looked at the readout on the sensor relay clipped to the tent's exterior panel. He looked at his coffee. He set the coffee down with the careful deliberateness of someone filing a formal complaint through the only channel available to them. The alert pattern was wrong. That was the first thing, and it was enough. He had spent 11 months cataloging the pressure signatures of Cathara 7 wildlife against his perimeter, the territorial browsers that circled without committing, the ambush predators that moved in the stop-start rhythm of something managing its own patience. And what the sensor was reporting now moved in intervals that nature did not generally bother to produce. Consistent, measured, repeating with the regularity of something that had been designed to move that way. He stepped outside. Sale was already awake. She was standing at the edge of the camp facing the northern tree line with the full, still attention of someone who recognized exactly what she was looking at and had been hoping, until this moment, that she was wrong. The thermal blanket was folded with a neatness that suggested she had been up for some time. She did not look at him when he came out. "How long?" he said. "Since first light," she said. "I didn't want to wake you." He looked at the tree line. Nothing visible. That was not, under the circumstances, reassuring. The not visible quality of it had a texture to it, a stillness in a band of vegetation that was never entirely still. "What is it?" he said, and it was not the question of a man who wanted the general shape of the situation. It was the question of a man who had decided the trust threshold had been reached by the evidence currently registering on his perimeter sensors. Sale turned then. The bioluminescent threads in her eyes were moving faster than he had seen them move before, which he was beginning to understand was not a decorative feature. "Tracking hardware," she said. "Military adjacent. The company that made it would describe it as survey grade, because the company that made it is very careful about what it says in public." She paused. 2 units, probably. The pattern suggests 2. He took this in the way a field person takes the kind of information that recontextualizes the last 12 hours, not with visible reaction, but with the internal adjustment of someone resetting their understanding of the terrain. "The expedition," he said, "Found something," she said, "in the northern ridge system, something that someone else had found first and wanted found privately." The filaments in her eyes pulsed. "We did not know that when we filed the survey report. The report went through the standard colonial frontier channels." A pause that had an apology in it, or something close to one. "They were behind us before we understood why." Eli looked at the tree line again. The sensor relay ticked another alert, same interval, half a meter closer on the northern axis. "How many people were in your expedition?" he said. "7, she said. And then, because he was going to ask, and because she had already decided what the answer was, "I don't know." The humor arrived where it always arrived on Cathara 7, in the margins of the moment where the alternative was something less sustainable. Eli went back to the camp stove. He picked up his coffee. He drank half of it in one motion and then held the cup and looked at nothing in particular for a moment. "I want you to know," he said, "that I filed a completely normal position report yesterday. Contents, resupply complete, equipment status unchanged, no anomalous activity. Bess gave me a weather update in return. It was going to rain Thursday." Sale looked at him. "I'm just noting the contrast," he said, "between where I thought this week was going and where it appears to be going." Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, but the architecture of one, briefly, before the tree line reasserted its position as the most important thing in either of their sight lines. He put down the coffee. His mind was already moving through the camp's geometry, sight lines, defensible positions, what the equipment containers could and couldn't do, what the terrain north of the fire pit offered versus what it concealed. 11 months of learning one piece of land with professional thoroughness, and this was the first time he'd needed it for something other than keeping clients from making expensive mistakes. "The sensor logs go back 30 minutes before the alert," he said. "If they're using standard military-adjacent tracking hardware and they've been on your signal since the ridge," he stopped, looked at her. "Is there anything on you that transmits?" The pause was very short. "Not anymore," she said. "I removed it day 2. "Where?" "Creek bed, 14 kilometers nor-northwest." She held the pause for one more beat. "I put it inside a large animal I'd startled into moving south, so the signal would move," he said. "Consistently," she said, "for a while." He looked at her with the expression of a man, revising his initial read of a person. She received this with composure. "That bought time," she said, "not indefinitely." She glanced at the tree line where the sensors ticked again, less indefinitely than I'd hoped. He was already moving to the equipment containers, pulling the terrain overlay from his navigation kit, the one with 11 months of hand-annotated corrections over the Colonial Survey base map, because the Colonial Survey base map had been optimistic about 3 separate ridge approaches, and he had noted this in red at the time. The tracking units in the tree line held their interval. The morning light on Cathara 7 was copper-edged and unhurried, which felt like a personal slight. He spread the map across the container lid. "I know a place," he said. Sale came to look. She studied the terrain with the focused attention of someone who had been navigating it on foot for 3 days and had opinions. 4 kilometers, she said. 4.5, he said. "I'm not going to lie to you about the distance." She looked up at him. "That's an unexpectedly specific form of honesty for the current situation." "I find the small precisions help," he said, "when the large ones are out of my hands." She held his gaze for a moment. The filaments moved. Then she began folding the thermal blanket again, and the folding had the quality of a decision, and the decision had the quality of trust. And Eli Voss picked up his pack and did not examine any of that too carefully, because there was a gully 4 kilometers northeast that the planet's electromagnetic interference made into a dead zone for tracking systems. And getting there was the only plan available, and the plan needed to start now.